Lancaster became Britain's most celebrated bomber of World War II. The Lancaster served as Bomber Command's primary weapon in the latter half of the war. It became famous for its part in some of the most daring missions ever attempted. Today, only 2 operational Lancasters remain. This is the story of the AVRO Lancaster, by far the most outstanding bomber of World War II. This aircraft has come to represent the courage and determination of all who flew and fought in deadly, relentless aerial battle. In 1941, Nazi Germany dominated continental Europe. It was vital to destroy the military power of the Nazi dictatorship and the industrial strength that sustained it. There was only one way to strike directly at Hitler's brutal regime. The Allied forces needed an aircraft that was able to go behind enemy lines and destroy their war machine. Bomber Command were ordered to take over, and they started to take the fights to the enemy. But when Bomber Command first entered the war, they were no match for the enemy that they would face. The Blenheims, in the day, were sitting ducks to Hitler's single-engine fighters. Only 1 in 3 aircrafts ever succeeded in getting within 5 miles of its target. 50% of bombs fell in open countryside. During the Blitz, Britain itself had come under savage aerial attack. German bombing raids had taken the lives of over 43,000 civilians, and many more were seriously injured. The ruthless nature of the Nazi war machine and its indiscriminate killing of civilians generated a loathing of Hitler and all he stood for. There became an increasingly urgent need for aircraft that were powerful enough to cross the inhospitable skies of occupied Europe and strike hard at the heart of the Third Reich. It was into the backdrop of this devastation that created a new generation of warplane. The 4-engine heavy bomber. They were the Stirling, the Halifax, and the aircraft that would be described as the finest bomber of World War II, the AVRO Lancaster. Origins of the Lancaster. As an aircraft, the Lancaster was way ahead of its time. Its aggressive capability played a major role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. Its specialized missions became part of an aviation history, but its origins lay in another, far less successful design. 3 years before the outbreak of the war, Roy Chadwick, AVRO's chief designer, responded to an Air Ministry specification for a twin-engine medium bomber powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. The first prototype of this aircraft, the AVRO Manchester, flew on the 25th of July 1939. Problems were immediately obvious. The Vulture engines lacked power, and there were major handling issues. However, when war broke out 6 weeks later, the Manchester bomber was rushed into service. But the Vulture engines were prone to bearing failures and overheating that caused fires. In spite of modifications, the Manchester continued to suffer numerous problems affecting its performance and reliability. At AVRO, Chadwick and his team of designers were already planning to develop the Manchester into a potent 4-engine bomber. This would use the highly successful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine instead of the unreliable Vulture. Originally known as the Merlin Manchester, or Manchester Mark III, for security reasons, it was unofficially named the Lancaster by its design team. The Manchester's wingspan of 90 feet was extended to accommodate the extra engines. This increase in the wing area also improved the new aircraft's takeoff ability. The flying prototypes of the new aircraft were an immediate success. The name that had become legend was now official. The Lancaster Mark I was ordered into full production. As 1941 drew to a close, the AVRO Lancaster enters operational service, and the Bomber Command gained a new commander-in-chief, the single-minded and uncompromising Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris. The gathering strength of Bomber Command was used to wreck the centers of German war production, destroying their factories and manufacturing centers, and shattering the confidence of munition workers. Operations. On March 3, 1942, the Lancaster made its first operational sortie. It was a fairly unremarkable debut for such a remarkable aircraft. 4 Lancasters from the 44th Squadron took part in a night operation, laying anti-shipping mines off the German coast. The first operational bombing mission for the AVRO Lancaster came 7 days later. 2 Lancasters joined the force of 124 other aircraft in a night raid on the German city of Essen. 4 aircraft were lost during the raid. On the ground, very little damage was done to the city that was a center to many major German munition factories. Increasing numbers of Lancasters joined the squadrons of Bomber Command, and pilots converting from more familiar aircraft were quick to appreciate the Lancaster's flying qualities. A force of 12 Lancasters embarked on a daring daily raid deep into Germany. Accurate navigation and precision bombing were essential. It was a round trip of 1,250 miles to the Bavarian city of Augsburg. Flying at low level, confronted by enemy fighters and a hail of anti-aircraft fire, as they battled their way to the target, a factory producing diesel engines for the German U-boat fleet. In spite of losses, 8 Lancasters made it through the barrage to deliver their bombs precisely on target. Of the 12 Lancasters that took part in the raid, only 5 returned. 49 aircrew were missing. Squadron leader John Nettleton, who 5 weeks earlier had led the first operational flight made by the Lancasters, was awarded the Victoria Cross for his part in the operation and became a national hero. Production of submarine engines at the Augsburg factory was halted, but the plant was back in operation within a few short weeks. Such losses for so little result were unacceptable. If Bomber Command was to be instrumental in the war, there was no alternative but to fight under the cover of darkness. The focus for Bomber Command was the heavily industrialized Ruhr district of Germany, a region that produced 80% of coal supplies and 75% of steel. German defences were concentrated around these centres, creating an almost impenetrable barrier. The airmen of Bomber Command confronted the increasing strength of these defences, as Air Marshal Harris intensified the aerial bombardment of the Third Reich. On the 30th of May 1942, 73 Lancasters took part in the largest raid of the war so far. A total of 1,047 aircraft struck the city of Cologne. 41 aircraft were lost. In Cologne, production was halted at 36 major factories, and 70 others had their output reduced by half. However, within a month, production was back to normal for the damaged city. Bomber Command's losses amounted to the deaths of 11,300 aircrew in the first 3 years of the war. More than 12,000 would die in the 4th year alone. Air Chief Marshal Harris believed that the Bomber Command was the war-winning weapon. He committed to strike harder, and with increased frequency, right at the enemy's resources. In response to the actions of Bomber Command, Hitler demanded a huge expansion in output from German manufacturing industry. He also increased the defense infrastructure to protect it. Bomber Command then faced its gravest test in the ravages and horrors of war. Bomber Command had to fly up against formidable air defenses. Almost 1 million men served in Germany's air defense network, and another 1.5 million were engaged in air raid precautions and damage repair. There were over 150,000 anti-aircraft guns defending Germany's cities. The Nazis also deployed night fighters, who waited over target cities for Bomber Command to come and get them. Lancasters, on their nighttime bombing runs, had to fly straight and level. This made them easy targets. They would be picked up on enemy German radar, illuminated by searchlights, and then be shot down by anti-aircraft guns, or fell prey to the fighters. But Bomber Command came up with an ingenious solution to overcome the Germans' early warning systems. Window was the code name given to thousands of strips of aluminum foil cut to the exact lengths. These strips were dropped from the aircraft, and as they fluttered in the ground, they formed a metallic cloud and reflected radar and rendered the tracking systems useless. This proved to be amazingly effective at disguising the positions of the Allied aircraft. The Lancaster's destructive power. The primary function of the Lancaster was a heavy bomber. Because of its unique design, the Lancaster was capable of carrying its wide range of different types of bomb. Special ordnance included 2 4,000-pound cookies joined together to make a single 8,000-pound blast bomb. The 12,000-pound, 21-foot-long Tallboy, which required some modification to the bomb doors. The most impressive was the Grand Slam, 25,000 pounds earthquake bomb. Tallboy and Grand Slam were the work of the scientist, engineer, and innovator Barnes Wallis. His most original weapon was undoubtedly the bouncing dam-busting mine. The bouncing bomb was carried exclusively by specially adapted Lancasters. The attack on Möhne and Erdelsee dams was carried out by 617 Squadron's Lancasters, and this incredible assault was later reenacted in a famous feature film. Operation Chastis took place in May 1943 and resulted in catastrophic flooding to the industrial Ruhr Valley and to the villages in the Eder Valley. Led by 24-year-old Wing Commander Guy Gibson, a veteran of more than 170 bombing and night fighter missions, 21 bomber crews were selected from 5 group squadrons. The crews included RAF personnel of several nationalities, members of the Royal Australian Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, and Royal New Zealand Air Force. This operation alone had an enormous impact in disrupting Hitler's supply chain and secured the Lancasters' legendary status in aviation history. On the 13th of February 1945, Bomber Command carried out Operation Thunderclap. 796 Lancasters formed the main strike force that targeted the German city of Dresden. This operation, which caused enormous controversy that endures today, saw intense bombing and a massive number of civilian casualties. There will be claims and counterclaims as to the importance of Dresden as a military target. Air Chief Marshal Harris was held responsible for ordering the attack, and it would taint his reputation for years to come. In April 1945, the Canadian Army had liberated much of the Netherlands, but in western part of the country, local people were starving. In stark contrast to their usual role, Lancasters were given a humanitarian mission. Operation Manna saw 31 Lancaster squadrons flying over 3,000 sorties in 9 days. Their mission was to drop food and supplies for the Dutch people. At the end of the war, Lancasters would again be deployed as a part of Operation Exodus. This was to assist in the homecoming and repatriation of Allied prisoners of war. During World War II, Lancasters dropped 608,613 tons of bombs, 51 million incendiaries, and over 12,000 mines on 156,308 missions. This made the Lancaster by far the most effective heavy bomber of the war, and its contribution to the defeat of the Nazis cannot be underestimated. Maintaining the Lancaster. Bomber Command aircrew were intimately aware of the crucial role they played in crippling the German war effort, and the high cost that was involved. It was teamwork that counted, and every crew knew that they would live or die by this. Each Lancaster required an immense effort to keep it operational. The 7-man crew, whose average age was 22, the flying control officer, and 2 WAF, women in the Air Force, assistants. A WAF parachute packer, the oil tanker when its driver, the 2,500-gallon petrol browser with 2 airmen, the bomb train with a WAF driver and 7 armoriers, up to 8 ground flight mechanics, a further 7 specialists, and lastly, the meteorological expert. Although it required 40 skilled men and women to maintain, service, and operate the Lancaster. The Canadian Lancaster. Of the 7,377 Lancasters that were ever built, just 17 complete planes are still in existence. Of this number, there are only 2 that are still airworthy and in flying condition. The first Lancaster, nicknamed Thumper, is part of the Royal Air Force Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, which operates from RAF Coningsby in Lincolnshire, UK. Aside from the Lancaster, the BBMF also has 6 Spitfires and 2 Hurricanes. The second Lancaster, nicknamed Vera, is the prized possession of the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton, Ontario. This particular Lancaster was built in Canada in July 1945 and later converted to an RCAF 10MR configuration. Vera did not see combat service itself, although it did fly in the Royal Canadian Air Force for 19 years. In 1952, it suffered a serious accident and received a replacement wing center section from a Lancaster that had flown in combat over Germany. In 1977, Vera underwent 11-year total restoration and has been flown continuously since 1988. For those of you who want to truly experience this Lancaster, you can actually become a member and buy a ticket to fly in this magnificent aeroplane. In August 2014, Vera was flown over to England. There she joined Thumper, and the 2 Lancasters were flown around England for 7 weeks. This gave millions of people the opportunity to see the last 2 flying Lancasters. Before then, the last time anyone saw Lancasters flying together was in Canada in 1964, some 50 years earlier. Canada was the only country within Bomber Command to have their own bomber group. Number 6 RCAF Bomber Group was commanded by Canadians, manned by Canadians, and were flying Canadian-built Lancasters. Canada was the only country that had the duty and responsibility in the war effort in Bomber Command. Sadly, 10,695 young Canadians lost their lives in Service Number 6 Bomber Group, and also flying with some of the Royal Air Force bomber squadrons. So there was a very high cost to pay by all of those who served in Bomber Command. However, this did not change the outcome of the war. It forced the enemy to defend themselves, as opposed to going on the offensive against the Allied forces. Thousands of Canadian airmen and ground crew served with the RCAF and RAF Lancaster squadrons in England during the war. By late 1944, the Canadian No. 6 Group of Bomber Command operated 13 squadrons of Lancasters in the war against Germany. At home, thousands more Canadians worked at Victory Aircraft in Moulton, Toronto, to produce 430 Lancaster Mark X's between 1943 and 1945. The Canadian Lancaster is dedicated to the memory of Pilot Officer Andrew Mynarski and is officially referred to as the Mynarski Memorial Lancaster. It is painted in the colours of his aircraft KB-726, which was shot down in flames by an aircraft German night fighter on June 13, 1944. As the bomber fell, he attempted to free the tail gunner, trapped in the rear turret of the blazing and out-of-control aircraft. The tail gunner miraculously survived the crash and lived to tell the story, but sadly, Andrew died from severe burns. For his bravery, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the Commonwealth's highest award for gallantry. Epilogue. During World War II, Bomber Command had a very difficult job. They flew night bombing missions deep into enemy territory. For the 125,000 men and women that served in Bomber Command, the cost and sacrifice was very high. 55,573 were killed performing their duty. As a young airman, the best odds of surviving a tour, 30 missions, was about 40%. It was the highest loss rate of any British armed forces in the Second World War. From 1942 right through to 1945, the Lancaster was the main aggressive side to the Allied war effort. Bomber Command did not win the Second World War independently, but the war could not have been won without them. The RAF's attacks forced Germany on the defensive, and the Lancaster played the leading role in that. The young men and women of Bomber Command faced dangers that today we can barely imagine. It's hard to comprehend the sheer scale and magnitude of the human sacrifice that was made in the defense of our freedom. The controversial Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command, Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, would pay tribute to the men who flew and fought in these battles. There is no parallel in warfare to such courage and determination in the face of danger, over so prolonged a period. Such devotion must never be forgotten.